In the middle of a war zone, under a burning orange sky streaked with smoke, a young American pilot named James Jim Harris gripped the controls of his F-4 Phantom fighter jet. The year was 1972, and the Vietnam War had reached one of its most dangerous peaks. Jim was only 24, full of courage and duty, believing that his mission in the skies mattered. But on that day, everything he thought he knew about enemies, war, and humanity was about to change forever. The cockpit alarm screamed as tracer bullets cut through the clouds. His plane shuddered violently, tail hit by anti-aircraft fire. The controls were failing, and the horizon was spinning out of control. Smoke poured in, his co-pilot yelling something Jim couldn't hear over the chaos. The only thing left to do was eject. With one final breath, he pulled the handle and was launched into the sky, his parachute deploying just in time. Seconds later, his plane exploded in a fiery blast below him. He hit the ground hard, crashing through the trees, his body bruised and bleeding. The air was heavy with humidity, the smell of gunpowder and wet earth mixing in the jungle around him. He had landed deep in enemy territory, miles away from any friendly forces. His radio was dead. His survival kit had scattered during the fall. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant voices, reminded him that he wasn't supposed to be alive. For hours, he dragged himself through the dense vegetation, trying to find cover. Each step was agony, a reminder of the shrapnel lodged in his side. He could hear voices in the distance, Vietnamese soldiers. They were searching for him. He pressed himself into the dirt, heart pounding so loud he thought they could hear it. A group of armed men passed close by, their boots crushing the undergrowth. Jim held his breath, praying they would keep walking, but then fate made its move. A young Vietnamese soldier, no older than Jim himself, suddenly turned his head. Their eyes locked. For a split second, time froze. Jim expected the shot, the pain, the end, but the soldier didn't raise his weapon. Instead, he lowered it. He made a small motion with his hand, signaling for Jim to stay quiet. Jim didn't understand what was happening. The soldier whispered something in Vietnamese, words that meant nothing to Jim, but the tone wasn't threatening. It was calm, almost reassuring. The young man gestured for Jim to follow him, then carefully led him through the jungle away from the others. They moved quietly, step by step, until they reached a small hut made of bamboo and leaves hidden deep in the trees. The soldier pointed to a corner and whispered, "Stay." Then he disappeared. Jim sat in the dark, dizzy from pain and confusion. Minutes turned into hours. Then the soldier returned, carrying a small tin can and a cloth. He cleaned Jim's wound as best as he could, fed him rice and water, and said nothing more. They didn't speak the same language, but somehow they understood each other. For 2 days, the young Vietnamese soldier cared for the man he was supposed to kill. He brought food, checked the jungle for patrols, and stayed near the hut to make sure Jim wasn't discovered. When it was time for Jim to leave, the soldier handed him a small piece of paper with a rough sketch of a river drawn on it. He pointed in that direction and said one word in broken English, "Go." Jim hesitated, unsure how to thank the man. He pressed his hand to his chest, trying to express gratitude. The soldier nodded once, then stepped back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. Jim made his way toward the river, barely staying conscious. 2 days later, he was found by an American rescue team. When they brought him back to base, everyone called it a miracle. But Jim knew it was something else, a gift from the very man who was supposed to be his enemy. Years passed. The war ended, but the memories didn't. Jim came home to the United States, married, and started a family. He went back to flying, then retired from the Air Force. On the surface, life was good. But deep down, he carried a story no one could truly understand. Every night, when he closed his eyes, he saw the same face, the young soldier with kind eyes who saved him. Sometimes his wife would find him sitting quietly on the porch, lost in thought. "Thinking about the war again?" she'd ask gently. He would nod, but he never told her everything. He didn't even know the man's name. For decades, Jim wondered who that soldier was. Did he survive the war? Did he have a family? Did he ever think about the American pilot he spared? The questions lingered unanswered. 40 years went by. Jim grew older, his hair turning gray. But the memory of that moment never faded. One day, after attending a veterans reunion, Jim decided he couldn't let the mystery go on any longer. He began searching for the man who had once spared his life. He contacted veteran organizations, wrote letters to both American and Vietnamese archives, and spoke to journalists who covered war reunions. Most people said it would be impossible. There were too many soldiers, too few records, and too much time had passed. But Jim didn't care. He had to try. Months turned into a year. He almost gave up. Then one morning, as he was sipping his coffee, an email arrived from a journalist in Hanoi. It said, "Mr. Harris, I believe I've found the man you're looking for." Jim's hands trembled as he read the details. The soldier's name was Nguyen Van Hoa. He was 65 years old, living in a small village in northern Vietnam, working as a farmer. When the journalist showed him an old photo of Jim from his Air Force days, Hoa's eyes filled with tears. "Yes," he said softly, "that's him." Within days, Jim booked a flight. When he arrived in Vietnam, he was greeted by reporters, veterans, and curious villagers. The air was thick with emotion. Down a narrow dirt path lined with palm trees, an old man stood waiting. His back was slightly bent, his hair silver, but his eyes were the same. Calm, gentle, human. Jim took one look at him and stopped walking. For a moment, the decades disappeared. He was no longer an old veteran. He was that terrified young pilot again, staring into the face of the man who had once chosen mercy over duty. Neither of them spoke. They simply walked toward each other and embraced. The cameras clicked, but the world around them faded into silence. Two old men, from two nations that once called each other enemies, stood holding on to each other like brothers finally reunited. Through a translator, Jim said, "You saved my life," Hoa smiled, his voice soft. "I was told to kill you, but when I saw your face, I saw fear, not hatred. You were young, like me. I couldn't do it." Tears filled Jim's eyes. "You didn't just save me," he said. "You changed my life." For the next 3 days, they spent every moment together. They sat under the shade of banana trees, laughing, sharing stories about their families, and looking through faded photographs. Jim showed pictures of his wife and grandchildren. Hoa showed his own, children, grandchildren, the farm where he worked every day. At one point, Jim asked him, "Do you ever regret not pulling the trigger?" Hoa shook his head. "If I had killed you," he said quietly, "I would have killed myself inside. War ends, but humanity must live," they both cried. They both knew the truth of what those words meant. Before Jim left, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. His old Air Force pilot wings, the same ones he wore the day he was shot down. He placed them in Hoa's hands and said, "These belong to you now." Hoa held them carefully as though they were made of glass. Later, he placed them in a small wooden box beside his family altar. "Now," he said, smiling softly, "we are brothers." When journalists asked Jim what it felt like to find his enemy, he said, "I went searching for the man who saved me. But what I found was much bigger than that. I found my humanity." As they said goodbye, Jim hugged Hoa one last time. "We met in war," he whispered, "but we part in peace." Back in the United States, Jim shared his story with schools, veteran groups, and community events. Each time, people were left in tears. He didn't talk about politics or blame. He talked about kindness, mercy, and how even in war, there are moments that remind us what it means to be human. Ho's village later honored him for his act of compassion, calling him a hero, not because he killed, but because he chose not to. The two men stayed in touch until the end of their lives, writing letters and video calling through translators. They often laughed about the irony. Two old soldiers, once enemies, now lifelong brothers. Years later, Jim was asked in an interview what he would say to the young men and women who serve today. His answer was simple. "Remember," he said, "the people on the other side of the gun are just like you, scared, human, and hoping to make it home. One act of mercy can outlive 100 wars." When Jim passed away, his family found a photo framed beside his bed. It was of him and Hoa, smiling together in that Vietnamese village. Beneath it, he had written in neat handwriting, "My brother saved me, not from death, but from hate." The photo now hangs in a veterans museum, next to a plaque that reads, "Sometimes the greatest victories aren't won in battle. They're found in compassion." Stories like Jim and Hoa's remind us that even in the darkest corners of humanity, light can still break through. Enemies can become friends, fear can become understanding, and war, for all its cruelty, can still give birth to extraordinary moments of peace. If this story touched you, share it. Because somewhere right now, there's another pair of people on opposite sides of the world who might one day realize that the things dividing them are smaller than the humanity they share.